All right, hello everyone. I'd like to acknowledge, of course, the traditional owners of this very fine country we see behind us, and share my respects for their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also, of course, like to acknowledge our wonderful speakers tonight, the Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers, and our keynote speaker for tomorrow's breakfast, Shashi Tharoor. There are a number of ambassadors here, excellencies. Thanks for joining us. And I'd also like to acknowledge the numerous AIIA fellows and also many AIIA members here tonight. But it's my job to introduce Dr. Heather Smith, who you already know. So I'd like to bring her up to the stage and have her introduce the Treasurer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryce, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to start tonight by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us this evening. It's my pleasure this evening to welcome Australia's Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers, to address us, and a special welcome, as Bryce said, to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, MP, who is both an author, a politician and a former international diplomat, who will address us tomorrow morning at the National Press Club, so welcome. And to all of our distinguished guests here tonight, welcome and thank you for coming along. This evening you'll actually have the benefit of listening to 3 Queenslanders in a row, which, you know, for some people must be a real treat, for others it must invoke other reactions. But it's myself, obviously, and then Treasurer Chalmers, and then the Honourable Paul Lucas, President of the Queensland branch of the AIIA. I should actually point out we have the Honourable Penny Wensley here, who's also a proud Queenslander. So, as we gather here to explore the challenges of our current global landscape, it is fitting to really reflect on the origins of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I should note we're not the Institute of Public Affairs at the front page of The Australian, referred to us today as. We're quite a different institution. The AIIA was established in the 1930s, initially as the New South Wales branch of Chatham House, and with the intention that it, alongside its parent entity, the Council on Foreign Relations in the US, would contribute to a better understanding of the world around us. The birth of the AIIA occurred in a time marked by economic hardship, shifting alliances, and growing instability. Like today, this was a period when informed, non-partisan debate was essential to navigating a turbulent world. In that spirit, the AIIA remains committed to fostering public understanding and discussion of international issues, especially now when the stakes are so high and the intergenerational consequences are so profound. In this context, I'm privileged to introduce our distinguished gala dinner keynote speaker, the Honourable Jim Chalmers, Treasurer of Australia. Since assuming office, Treasurer Chalmers has demonstrated a deep understanding of the interplay between Australia's economic priorities and the complex, often volatile international environment. His background as an economic policymaker, paired with his clear vision of Australia's role on the global stage, gives him a unique perspective on the challenges that we face. His recent address at the Lowy Institute captured the necessity of a coordinated and multifaceted approach to statecraft. In his words, it is essential that Australia uses all elements of national power to safeguard our interests and engage proactively with our neighbours. As Treasurer Chalmers highlighted, effective governance today requires both pragmatism and ambition. The marrying of these two approaches is instructive. Pragmatism without ambition risks a drift into populism and ultimately lost opportunities, wasted effort and declining living standards. Ambition without pragmatism can become an exercise in tilting at windmills, again with considerable effort expended, but in the end making little difference. I've known Jim Chalmers for quite some time, and it is this marrying of pragmatism and ambition that sets him apart from many others. His insights on balancing our economic imperatives with the realities of global interdependence have resonated widely and underscore his commitment to advancing Australia's place in the world. His visit to Beijing for the Australia-China Strategic Economic Dialogue reinforced this outlook, marking a significant step in our complex but crucial relationship with China. The Treasurer's approach acknowledges the ongoing challenges with China while recognising the mutual benefits of a constructive, albeit cautious, relationship. In his recent op-ed in the Australian Financial Review, Treasurer Chalmers made it clear that these are not the time for economists or indeed for treasurers to sit on the fence. His words highlight the need for decisive, well-informed action in economic policy, particularly in a world where economic pressures can quickly translate into broader security and societal challenges, as I discussed in my address this morning. His perspective closely aligns with the AIIA's dedication to fostering informed and proactive engagement with global issues, without prejudice or partisanship. Treasurer Chalmers' distinguished career includes serving as Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre, Chief of Staff to the then Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer Wayne Swan, and holding senior advisory roles across government. He is an accomplished scholar, holding a PhD in Political Science and International Relations from our Australian National University, and a first-class honours degree in Public Policy from Griffith University. His extensive background brings both academic rigour and practical experience to his role, equipping him to navigate the complex dynamics of today's economic landscape with insight and integrity. We are honoured to have Treasurer Chalmers with us this evening, and we look forward to hearing his reflections on Australia's economic and strategic challenges, and to gaining his insights on how we might best navigate this critical moment in history. Please join me in welcoming Treasurer Jim Chalmers.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much, first Bryce and then Heather, for the very kind invitation. Thank you, Heather, in particular, for the exceedingly gracious introduction. The way I see it is you can never have too many Queenslanders. And so it's good to be amongst friends. And it's hard to imagine a more important time to meet or a more welcome opportunity. Just after the most consequential American election we've seen, and just before our own Prime Minister joins his colleagues and counterparts at APEC in Peru and the G20 meetings in Brazil. So we have lots to discuss, and I'm sure that Penny and Simon made characteristically considered contributions to that already earlier in the day. But first I wanted to recognise that today is also a day of special and enduring significance for our country. Remembrance Day shapes profound parts of our national memory. It goes to our history of service and sacrifice, but also the beginnings of more of an independent voice on the world stage. The armistice of 1918 was one of those times when our foreign policy interests became a bit more distinct and defined. The stories of Billy Hughes clashing with Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference are legendary. Wilson famously questioned why Hughes was even there in the first place because he only represented 5 million people. And Hughes's response that he stood for 60,000 dead was an important and perhaps foundational moment in our national story. It was an important point in time for the Australian Institute of International Affairs as well. Quite remarkably, this organisation traces its roots back to the debates coming out of that Paris Peace Conference. And in its wake, organisations formed and eventually amalgamated, as Heather reminded us, in the 1930s to become what we know today as the AIIA. A long time ago, but still only a fraction of the millennia that the Ngunnawal people have been gathering here on this land, watching the sun set from the top of this beautiful low valley where we meet tonight. I acknowledge their elders, their customs and their culture. The Ngunnawal speak of Nengi Bamir, and Nengi Bamir roughly translates as the long view. And as I look around the room, I see thinkers and diplomats and officials who are all accustomed to taking that long view, playing that long game, balancing the tactical and the strategic, the near-term pressures and the longer-term opportunities in relationships and in economies. And I wanted to personally thank many of you who are here, who for more than a decade now have been sharing your time with me, your thinking, your writing and your reading as well. Now, even on the way in, seeing Peter Drysdale and Hugh White and Martin Parkinson, and in more recent times, Helen Mitchell and others, who have been so kind and so gracious in sharing with me and with my colleagues the very best of Australian scholarship and thinking and diplomacy to make sure that as we try and navigate the difficult international terrain that we navigate as governments, that we can rely on you and your advice and your help. Now, rather than single everybody out individually, I wanted to just make two more exceptions. Heather, who co-led our intelligence review, who led government departments, led Australia's presidency of the G20 in 2014 and is now doing a remarkable job leading the AIIA. Being able to accept Heather's very kind invitation is one reason why I'm very pleased to be here with you all tonight. And another is the chance to spend time with my friend Paul Lucas, who I believe is speaking after me. And I wanted to thank Heather, thank Paul, and thank all of you for joining us here tonight. Now, I can think of at least three reasons why it's been a long time since it would have been considered strange for a Treasurer to address a gathering of foreign policy thinkers like this. First, foreign policy, like economic policy, is a team effort, and increasingly so. Second, ever since Treasurer Keating opened our economy much more to global forces, and Treasurer Swan brought fortitude and foresight to the G20's emergency response to the global financial crisis, the role of Treasurer has internationalised in important and, I think, welcome ways. And the third reason is because so many of our pressing economic challenges are global, and that makes economic security a really central question for all of us. So if you think about it this way, in the last 15 years, Australians have experienced three major economic shocks with profound consequences. Each of them were global. A financial crisis which began in the United States, a pandemic which began in China, the inflation spike that followed, exacerbated by war, first in Ukraine and now in the Middle East. Economic policy and foreign policy have always been interlinked, but now they're almost indistinguishable. And in this uncertain world characterised by economic vulnerability and volatility, our foreign policy is a team effort which brings economic benefits. And here I wanted to pay tribute to the leadership of Prime Minister Albanese, the extraordinary work of Ministers Wong and Miles and Farrell and Conroy and Watts and Ayres, and all of the ministers and officials associated with the progress that we've made in the world in a short time, the economic dividends from which are obvious. Stabilising our relationship with China has seen nearly $20 billion of trade restrictions lifted and the strategic economic dialogue restarted. A new trade agreement with India has opened doors for our exporters in the world's most populous country and fifth biggest economy. New critical mineral partnerships with Japan and South Korea are strengthening our supply chains. The Southeast Asia economic strategy will see more capital flow more effectively in our region in the service of our national and collective economic and strategic interests. The Future Made in Australia agenda will help us engage, not retreat, as an indispensable part of the supply chains which are critical to the global net zero transformation. This means jobs and opportunities are created for our workers and our businesses and our investors here in Australia. Now, in each of these areas, treasurers now have important roles and responsibilities, and I've embraced them. And to illustrate this point, I asked the team to dig out how many international meetings I've participated in since we were elected in May of 2022. I was a bit surprised to learn that there have already been 143 meetings in a little over 2 years. This includes 63 bilaterals with economic ministers. That's a big slice of time and effort, but it's worth it. It matters, and there are patterns. Of those 143 meetings, 92 of them, around 2/3 of them, have been with or focused on the Indo-Pacific. And around 87%, or 55 of my meetings with economic ministers were those representing our region. As the world's economic activity concentrates in the Indo-Pacific, so do our diplomatic and economic efforts. It's where the action is strategically and economically. I've taken 19 meetings with economic ministers from our top two-way trading partners. But we haven't chosen between bilateral and multilateral effort. We've engaged whenever and wherever we can, because we believe multilateral institutions are more important now than ever. That's why I've attended 23 multilateral meetings, had 11 direct discussions with the heads of our multilateral development banks, the IMF and the OECD. At the first time, I was the first treasurer to meet with counterparts in China for 7 years, the first to convene meetings of treasurers and climate ministers with our New Zealand friends on both sides of the ditch, and the first in 2 decades to attend a Pacific Islands Forum Economic Ministers meeting in Suva. And I wanted to dwell for a minute here on the Pacific on some work that Stephen Jones and I have been doing in the Treasury portfolio in the Pacific. We knew back when we were elected in May of 2022 that for too long Pacific ties had been taken for granted. And we've done our best to reverse that, to restore our status as a partner of choice in the Pacific. A big part of that has been about banking. At the Pacific Banking Forum we hosted in July, we made clear that one of Australia's highest foreign and economic policy priorities is connecting the Pacific with global finance. Ever since then, we've been in discussions with partners in the neighbourhood and around the world, with businesses at home and overseas, taking the time and doing the work to guarantee the future of finance in the Pacific. And we're very grateful to the Australian banks for engaging with us as part of that genuinely team effort. All have been cooperative and constructive, going out of their way to support our national interest. And tonight I wanted to confirm that we're in the final stages of negotiations with ANZ to secure its continuing banking presence in the Pacific. And this will ensure ANZ's 9 existing operations from Fiji to the Cook Islands maintain their services. The deal that we're working on is another big part of our efforts to keep communities and economies connected and finance flowing in our neighbourhood. It's as good as an example as any of the contribution that we can make in economic portfolios to our foreign policy efforts. But regional and global conditions loom large across all of our work, not just some of it. We talk about our domestic economic policy having 3 planks: relief, repair and reform, but if there's a 4th R, it's region. Global conditions are soft, and this influences our policies and our posture in our part of the world. In the decade prior to the GFC, the world's economy grew at an average of 4.1%, but over the last 15 years it's been just 3.1%. In the last year alone, most of the OECD has had at least one negative quarter of growth, some more than one. And IMF economists are not expecting things to improve much over the next 5 years. If their forecasts are realised, this will be the weakest period of growth since the 1990s, an indication that the global economy is still full of volatility and vulnerability. A soft landing is assumed but not yet assured. Global inflation has moderated from its peaks, but it's lingering longer than we would like, with inflation ticking up in the euro area in October. But as price pressures overall recede, the impact of a couple of years of monetary policy tightening is also becoming more apparent, with unemployment higher and rising in many countries, including Canada and New Zealand. And these broader challenges to growth could be exacerbated by developments in China. Back in September, as Heather was kind enough to mention, I was in Beijing for the resumption of the Strategic Economic Dialogue at the same time as the first raft of stimulus measures were announced by Chinese authorities. Those two things weren't related. These were followed up by another package announced over the weekend to ease financing constraints for local governments. And while it's too early to tell the full impact of these latest measures, they are welcome. They've already boosted confidence. For example, Chinese equity markets have risen by 30% since September. And I share some of the cautious optimism that this positive sentiment could feed through to demand and then support global growth. But this is tempered by the structural pressures facing consumers in China, which are likely to linger for longer. These still weigh on the global economy at the same time as conflict and political uncertainty threatens further disruption. Now, in this world of churn and change, I still like Australia's chances, now and into the future. We're confident, but we're not complacent about a soft landing in our own economy, and we're comfortable with the policy choices that we've made to help deliver it. We acknowledge that our people in Australia are doing it tough, just as any objective observer should acknowledge the progress that has been made on our government's watch. Inflation has more than halved and it's back in the Reserve Bank's target band for the first time since 2021. Real wages are growing again and the gender pay gap is closing. 1 million jobs have been created for the first time in a single parliamentary term, and Labor participation is at record highs. Substantial, meaningful and responsible cost of living help is flowing, including a tax cut for every taxpayer. At the same time as we've delivered the first budget surpluses for almost 2 decades and shaved $150 billion in debt as a consequence. This is actually the biggest nominal turnaround in our budget ever. It's one of the reasons why we've gone from the 14th strongest budget in the world in 2021 to top 3 now, according to the IMF rankings released at our G20 meetings last month. Now, those meetings were a very timely and valuable opportunity to compare notes with an array of leaders. Secretary Yellen, Fed Chair Powell, Canadian Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, UK Chancellor Reeves, Japanese Finance Minister Kato, South Korean Deputy Prime Minister Choi, and others. Now, the formal focus of our meetings was economic resilience. But meeting in DC less than a fortnight before the American elections meant that there was obviously a lot of discussion about that as well. And now, with the results known, we've seen markets respond in pretty dramatic ways. Equities recorded their biggest single-day gain in 2 years the day after the election, up 4.3%. Markets pared back their expectations of future rate cuts, even as the Fed proceeded as expected, with another one last Thursday, still leaving their policy rate higher than ours. All this led to a bond sell-off, which saw yields temporarily rise above 4.4%, the highest since July. I mention all of these stats because it shows that the markets expect change, and so do we. But our relationship with America under presidents and prime ministers from all sides is strong and enduring. It's built on shared values and interests and deep engagement, not partisan or ideological ties. Our Prime Minister was among the first to talk to President Trump after his victory. Of course, we expect the US administration to bring a different suite of policies, and we're confident in our ability to navigate that change as partners, and nobody should underestimate our ability to make that work. We are well placed and we are well prepared. Like any diligent country, Australia was ready for either outcome. Back in September, I commissioned Treasury modelling on different trade and tariff policy scenarios so that I could brief my colleagues in the Cabinet and the National Security Committee. And tonight I wanted to give you a sense of what it showed us. In short, Treasury's analysis demonstrated that we should expect a small reduction in our output and additional price pressures, particularly in the short term. But specific features of our economy, like a flexible exchange rate, an independent central bank, will help us mitigate against some of this. Globally, we would expect the impact to be much more substantial. The timing of this and the responses and ramifications that might follow, what economists call the second round effects, are difficult to predict. But we wouldn't be immune as Australians from escalating trade tensions that might ensue. This is consistent with the views expressed last week by the Prime Minister, the Treasury Secretary, the Reserve Bank Governor, and the CEOs of two of our major retail banks. So the Treasury modelling was one part of our preparation. Another was the diligent work done in DC. And here I wanted to pay tribute to Kevin Rudd. As the Prime Minister and Penny Wong made clear last week, Kevin is doing an excellent job as Australia's ambassador to the United States, helping to strengthen the alliance, finding new areas for us to deepen economic cooperation, and building good relationships with Republicans and Democrats alike. And I've seen this for myself. Before the US election, Ambassador Rudd helped many of us build and deepen our connections across the political aisle. He introduced me to Lael Brainard, the Director of President Biden's National Economic Council and a key figure in Vice President Harris's orbit. We met again, Lael and I, in the West Wing just before the election. He also introduced me to Scott Bessent. We had a long discussion after dinner at the Ambassador's residence 2 Thursdays ago. Now, getting more than an hour with a key member of President Trump's economic team 12 days before the election was a very valuable opportunity. And we spoke about monetary policy, we spoke about inflation, and of course we spoke about tariffs and trade. And here I wanted to be very clear that an uptick in trade restrictions is a global trend. It's not actually limited to any one country. Around the world, these restrictions have doubled since 2019, with an average of 6,000 new barriers introduced every year. After rebounding from the pandemic, global trade volumes grew by less than 1% last year. And a recent IMF report showed that while trade is deepening between countries aligned geopolitically, it is declining between those who aren't. Now, we are more exposed than others to this kind of global fragmentation, the kind that Heather spoke about this morning. I wanted to give you a couple of numbers to illustrate this point. Traded goods and services are about a quarter of America's GDP, about a quarter. For the euro area, that number is a bit less than a third. But for Australia, trade is half of our economy. Trade is half of our economy. Consider the same point another way. Almost a quarter of US cross-border trade is done with Mexico and Canada, and only 10% with China. Over 60% of the EU's total trade in goods is within the EU, and only 15% with China. But here in Australia, our biggest trading relationships stretch right across the Pacific, but China accounts for more than a quarter of our total trade. And here at this point, I wanted to draw a distinction between de-risking supply chains and decoupling. De-risking is legitimate. It can be warranted. It can be made necessary because of unreliable supply chains or other forms of economic or geopolitical tension. Most countries are doing this in one way or another, and we are no exception. Decoupling is different, and it can be much more problematic. And because of our combination of industrial, geographical, geological, meteorological and geopolitical advantages, we stand to be among the biggest beneficiaries of de-risking. We can make a bigger contribution to more resilient, diverse, regional and global supply chains for energy and technology and critical minerals. And we can develop new industries to respond to global demand for green metals and green hydrogen. But because of our outward-facing economy, decoupling could limit our markets and constrain our growth. And this point that de-risking is good for us, decoupling is problematic for us, is really the main conclusion I wanted to leave with you tonight. Nobody wins from a trade war, but we have more at stake than most. As the PM pointed out, we need a global economy which is open and where everyone plays by the rules. The world is already too volatile and too vulnerable. The pace of disruption and dislocation around us is already considerable. Our own intergenerational report identified the 5 biggest transformations in our societies and in our economies from younger to older, from IT to AI, from hydrocarbons to renewables, from an old industrial base to a new one, and from globalisation towards fragmentation. But if we take the Nengi Bamir, the long view of what's behind us and what's ahead of us, some things are really clear. Australians were among the biggest beneficiaries of 3 decades of relative calm between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the global financial crisis. And now we have to position ourselves as the primary beneficiaries of all of this churn and change by de-risking, not decoupling, and by continuing to align our economic and foreign policies, objectives and interests in ways that have been central to the progress that the government has made in the world and in our economy at home, with the help and with the intellectual horsepower of so many of you here tonight. Thanks very much and enjoy the evening.
Well, thank you, Treasurer, and Your Excellencies and colleagues. It falls upon me to say a few words to comment on your excellent contribution that you've given here to us tonight. You indicated that Australia is a trading economy. 50% of our economy is exported, and we often talk about the great advantage from biosecurity, from defence issues, of being an island, but then of course the great challenge, of course, when you're exporting. And we spoke about some of the geostrategic issues with that today, and a quarter of that trade being with China. You spoke about the uncertain world that we live in and spoke about our relationship with China, about the need to be able to disagree in a manner that makes our point of view clear as a nation, but does not in fact make Australians worse off. It might surprise, or maybe not surprise, many of you that in the middle of our dispute with China, we didn't actually have any change in coal or iron ore exports to China. It was agriculture, it was lobsters, it was primary industries, it was wine that suffered the penalty for that. We need to be able to agree to disagree and do that in the right way. Similarly, we can't lecture the United States about how it engages globally if we're not prepared to do the same in our own area, such as the Pacific. And Treasurer, you mentioned some of those initiatives, such as the ANZ, such as we spoke about today, Telstra and Digicel. And in fact, something passionate to you and I, as from a rugby league state, the work that the Albanese government is doing in PNG with NRL. If you don't understand rugby league and don't understand PNG, you do not understand the value of that diplomatically for this country. You did your PhD on Paul Keating's economic policies, and one of the great things, and that you didn't highlight tonight, but I think is important, and that is national superannuation. When I did my economics degree, not as well as Heather did hers at the University of Queensland 300 years ago, me, not Heather, Australia had one of the lowest propensities to save in the world. Thanks to national superannuation, we're net exporters of capital and actually get the benefit of that. But you don't get away, Treasurer, without one ask from us. Successive intergenerational reports have indicated that those of us who are older, those people at that table that you're at, me and the others, need an economy and need a country where we have people who are coming who are better educated and are younger than the rest of us. And there's one source for them, and that's migration. The third largest export industry of this country, I might add as well. No country on earth has 29.8% of its residents born overseas. No country on earth has over 50% of its residents with one parent overseas. And you only have to look around this audience tonight to see the different colours and complexions that you would not have seen when this organisation met 20, 30 or 40 years ago. But that's about us internally, economically. The other thing I would just observe, that in what we can do overseas, in what we can do in engaging with overseas countries, we have the great advantage that no other country has in that we have native speakers from those countries who have chosen to live here and can help us navigate this uncertain world. Treasurer, thank you very much.